Uh, my name is Joshua Ferrier. I am a political science major, also studying Spanish and psychology here at Roanoke. And today I'm going to be presenting on freshwater resource management policy and its national security implications. Some very exciting stuff here. Just a couple acknowledgments here. This presentation is a product of a public policy analysis proposal that a group of us did last fall in Poly 250, which is public policy. And since then, Professor Kirby has pushed us to continue to improve our essay and to get it published. And 3 weeks ago now, we submitted it to the Public Knowledge Journal, and we're awaiting hearing from the reviewers. Also like to thank Carrie Bear, who was part of the group originally until she left the class, but she helped us with the initial preparations. And again, huge thanks to Professor Kirby for continuing to push us on this. So our abstract here is this is taken from our manuscript. A constant, reliable source of fresh water is critical to the survival needs of all. In this essay and this presentation, we ask an attempt to answer several questions. What are the current policies governing freshwater reserves in the United States? What problems relating to freshwater resources exist in the United States and worldwide? How does policy concerning freshwater reserves assist in the goal of maintaining the national security of the United States? And finally, what other policy alternatives might be enacted in order to ensure our national security and a bright future? Just a little bit of background. The United States is the Earth's leading consumer of water. We use more water than anyone else in the world, and this has been a trend that has existed for many decades now. And in recent years, in the 1980s, the consumption actually decreased, but now it's going back up, and we're still below the rate that we were at, the usage rate that we were at in the 1980s. However, it's still very high and is far exceeding the rate of recharge, which is the amount of water that the aquifers and the groundwater and freshwater reserves naturally get back each year. Freshwater resources are limited and finite, even though every year, every day in some places, we have rain. Water is still a finite resource. We have the same amount of water now that we had at the beginning of time, basically. And although recharge does occur, we are continuing to extract at a much higher rate, and this is a huge problem, because what we're doing is polluting the water that we use and putting it back into the water system. But as we'll talk about in a minute, the water, the aquifers aren't able to recharge at a fast enough rate. So basically what we could end up with is all our water becoming salinated, or all the water becoming polluted, and our aquifers and groundwater reserves dry up. And again, this is a growing global concern. So the policy concerns here in the United States are fairly broad and fairly large concerns. First of all, we have outdated doctrines. We have, to answer one of the first questions in our abstract, there really is no policy governing freshwater resource management. We have these doctrines that are basically guidelines, but these doctrines are outdated for one, and they do not address the problems that we have currently in the United States. These come from the 40s and 50s, some into the 60s, and today our water problems are much different than in the past, and these doctrines, A, are only guidelines, they're not official policy, and B, they do not fit the problems that we're having now. We also have questions of ownership and usage rights. Again, because there is no comprehensive policy on freshwater management, What we see is that states and localities are left on their own, and it's left up to them to answer questions of ownership, who owns the water, who owns the rights to the aquifers and the reserves, and also who gets to use it, how much they get to use, what they get to use it for, etc. We also see, like I said, unsustainable extraction, not only for drinking water, showering, for agriculture, energy production, manufacturing. Water is used in basically everything. Pollution, we're polluting our rivers and streams. We're also polluting the aquifers themselves. And by the way, I should mention that an aquifer is basically a pocket of water that's surrounded by stone and the earth that's underground. So we're polluting those pockets of water as well as our other reserves. There's no policy there's no comprehensive federal policy that addresses what to do in case of drought. So this year in the Midwest, for example, we're seeing very low rainfall, very dry conditions, and it's leading to extreme drought. But we have no policy that governs this. Again, the states and localities are left on their own to address these concerns, but what we see is no real unified direction, and it goes back to questions of ownership and usage rights in times of drought. Who gets to use it? What do they get to use it for? Also, a lot of these resources are transboundary, meaning that in the United States, for example, the Ogallala Aquifer is the largest aquifer. It's in the Midwest, and it's not just in one state. It literally is under the great majority of the Midwest. So we can see issues here in the United States between individual states. We can also see issues worldwide, United States, Canada. Some resources transcend those boundaries. In the Middle East in particular, there are a lot of aquifers and reserves that are not in one particular country, but go across borders. And that has led to a lot of conflict. Now we'll talk about freshwater resources and national security. First of all, what is national security? Mark Levy writes that a threat to national security refers to a situation in which some of the nation's most important values could be drastically degraded by external actions. So we ask, what are some of the most important national values of the United States? Here we turn to the preamble of the United States Constitution, perhaps the best source of our national values. And we find that domestic tranquility, the common defense, the general welfare, and the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity are the most sacred and important national values here in the United States. Threats to national security. So peace and protection is the first category here, and that relates to domestic tranquility and the common defense. What we're seeing is resource competition between states, between countries, and what it can result in is civil unrest or civil war, not just here in the United States, for example, but as we're seeing in the Middle East. Within one country, we have different factions that are vying for these water resources, and we're seeing not necessarily a declared civil war or anything of that nature, but we're seeing interpersonal conflict and violence. We're seeing death and some pretty bad conflict in the Middle East. Again, international violence and military action, they've coined these water wars, and not only can this violence occur within one country, but across boundaries. And the Middle East is, again, a perfect example. There are many regions where we see conflict across boundaries, and it's not necessarily, again, a declared war in the traditional sense, and that's why they've deemed them water wars in quotes. It's because it's not a traditional war, but it's a war nonetheless. Levy also refers to a coming anarchy that is likely in our future as a world if we do not address these concerns soon. The Next category that we talk about is health and a bright future, which relates to general welfare and the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. Simply put, water is critical for life. I mean, it doesn't get more basic than that. What happens without water? Dehydration, famine and starvation. We see an agricultural and industrial impact where we can't produce crops and food anymore. We can't produce anything in factories because we don't have water. And ultimately lead to death. And not just the death of a few. We're talking a large amount of death. And ultimately, if in many years we completely drain our water resources and do not do something to address this, it could mean the end of our civilization. It could mean the end of the human race, which seems very grim and very grandiose, but it's the sad truth. So the lack of policy here in the United States has a huge impact on these national security concerns. First of all, because of the decentralization and devolution of power to the states and the localities, this has resulted in conflict between states and conflict between localities, not violent conflict, but tension, I should say. And what we see is that different localities have different management paradigms, and there's no consensus on which to use, when to use what. There's no uniformity across the board. We also see, like I said, a lack of comprehensive freshwater resource management policy, which has resulted in confusion about ownership, distribution, and usage. And all these concerns have a great effect on our national security, in that if we don't address these concerns, then there's a huge threat to the security of the United States. We next move to policy alternatives and suggestions. This is not a comprehensive or an exhaustive list by any means. These are just 5 examples of policy that might be included in a broad, comprehensive policy. First of all, a withdrawal and recharge policy. Basically a policy that says you can take out this much water and it has to equal or be less than the recharge rate of the individual reserve. Imports from Canada. Canada has an insane amount of water. They have, I believe, 10 times more water than the United States does. However, they also have a tenth of the population that the United States does. I'm sorry, they have a tenth of the population. They have just slightly more water than we do. But again, because they have a tenth of the United States population, they could share with us and not be affected. We also look at water desalination, increased funding and encouragement for new technologies to be developed. Canada is already using water desalination technologies, and they're very effective. We also suggest domestic import-export policy. Right now there's something called the bottled water loophole, where you can't take a tanker truck and fill it with water and export it somewhere, but you can export water products. So they can export bottled water and make a profit off of it, but it's hurting us here in the United States because it's draining our reserves and giving it elsewhere. So we recommend closing this bottled water loophole, which seems a little bit hypocritical after talking about importing water from Canada. But again, Canada has slightly more water than us and only a tenth of the population, so it's very feasible for Canada to do. Finally, listening to the localities. Individual counties or cities can have a water management organization. There are also regional water authorities, and we don't recommend devolving power to these authorities, but we recommend consulting with them, working with them in order to develop new policy and in order to make sure that their concerns are being heard and that we address these issues in a way that does not make it harder on them, but also does not leave it to the individual localities to sort out what they want to do. Finally, conclusions. Obviously, large implications on national security. It doesn't get more basic than the fact that without water, we're all going to die. It's a pretty big national security threat. We also need a comprehensive federal water resource management policy. And finally, policy alternatives are available. There are many, many, many more out there than what we have here. And we need to explore more and more alternatives, more and more policy routes in order to create this comprehensive policy and in order to ensure that the United States security is maintained and preserved. So with that, if we have time.
Yeah. Let's do one question.
Okay. Any questions? Dean Smith.
Well, I mean, the call for a comprehensive federal policy seems to both be politically challenging.
Yes, sir.
And also challenging from a federal standpoint.
Yes, sir.
So, how do you foresee, have you thought about, under what conditions such a policy might be feasible?
Well, such a policy might be feasible if the House, the Senate, and the White House were all controlled by Democrats. That's the very simple answer. The more politically correct answer would be that such a policy would only be feasible if there is public education about the dangers that are posed by our usage and pollution of the water, and also if we ensure that, again, we listen to the localities, we work with the localities, which is something that the federal government is pretty terrible at. We all know. One of the things that the Western Virginia Water Authority told me when I met with a few of their officials was that a lot of the mandates that come down from the Environmental Protection Agency and other government agencies are unfunded mandates, meaning that the federal government tells them, you got to do this, but we're not going to help you. We're not going to give you any money. So, making sure that we listen to these localities and listen to what they're saying, and also that we fund these mandates, which again is going to take taxpayer money, and like I said originally, it's probably going to require Democrats to be in control, at least of one house, and pretty close in the other. So, all right. Well, thank you all very much.